The suitcase hit the floor before my mind finished deciding. I didn't pray about it. I didn't call anyone. I just stood in the middle of my bedroom at dawn, already dressed, already moving, like my body knew something my heart hadn't caught up with yet. My name is Rosalind, and I have learned to respect the kind of silence that feels louder than noise. For 3 months, my daughter Nadine had not answered a single call. Not once. No arguments, no explanations. Just distance that arrived slowly after she married Damien. Polite at first, then firm, then final. The last thing she told me was that she needed space, that marriage meant building her own world without interference. I gave it to her, even when it felt unnatural. A mother learns to step back when love demands patience. But that morning, patience felt wrong. Now, I woke up before sunrise with a tightness in my chest that refused to leave. Not fear, not panic, just certainty. The kind that doesn't shout. It stands quietly and waits until you listen. I walked into the kitchen, poured coffee I never drank, and stared at the phone on the counter longer than I should have. My thumb hovered over Nadine's name, then stopped. She had asked for distance, and I respected my child enough not to chase her into silence. Instead, I opened my laptop. One flight. No announcement, no warning. I packed lightly. One small suitcase, a neutral dress, the kind of things you bring when you're not sure what you're walking into. As the car pulled away from my house toward the airport, I kept replaying the last real conversation we had months ago. Nadine sounded different that day, softer but distant. Every sentence felt guided, like someone else had already decided what she was allowed to say. I told myself marriage changes people. I told myself not to imagine problems that weren't there. But intuition doesn't ask permission to exist. The plane ride felt shorter than it should have. I didn't sleep. I didn't read. I simply watched the clouds pass and wondered how a bond that strong could turn into silence without a reason I could see. By the time I landed in Florida, the unease had settled into something steadier. Not worry anymore, but focus. I rented a car, gave the driver at the lot Nadine's mansion address, the $2 million home I had given her as a wedding gift, and drove without turning on the radio. The closer I got, the quieter the world felt, like everything was waiting for me to notice what had already changed. The neighborhood looked the same, palm trees moving slowly in the wind, perfect lawns, large gates opening and closing without effort. Nothing outside suggested anything was wrong. But when I pulled up in front of the house, I didn't get out immediately. I sat there for a moment, engine still running, staring at the front door. The same door Nadine hugged me in front of the day she moved in, promising she would always keep me close, no matter how life changed. Something felt different. I didn't know what yet. I just knew I hadn't flown across the country for nothing. And as I reached for the door handle, preparing to finally step out of the car and walk toward the mansion, I felt the quiet certainty again, the one that had woken me before sunrise. I was about to learn why my daughter disappeared from my life. The door never opened. Now, I had barely stepped out of the car when a voice called gently from the side of the driveway. "Excuse me, are you looking for Nadine?" I turned slowly. An older woman stood near the neighboring yard, one hand resting against the low white fence, watching me with the careful expression of someone deciding how much truth to give a stranger. The morning sun sat high behind her, and for a moment I thought she had mistaken me for someone else. "Yes," I said calmly. "I'm her mother." Something shifted in her face. Not surprise, not curiosity. Relief. "Oh, then I'm glad you came," she said quietly, stepping closer but keeping her voice low, as if the house itself could hear us. "Honey, she doesn't live here anymore, hasn't for some time now." The words landed softly but didn't feel soft. I glanced toward the mansion again, and the curtains were drawn differently than I remembered. Heavier, darker. A man I didn't recognize crossed briefly behind the glass, his movement casual, like he belonged inside those walls. For a second, I wondered if I had misunderstood what I was seeing. "I think you should know where she is," the neighbor continued. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, handing it to me with hesitation. "She's staying in an apartment across town. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but you looked like you needed the truth." I unfolded the paper slowly. The address was written in quick handwriting, not a place I recognized, not anywhere near the life Nadine had been building when I last saw her. "Thank you," I said, keeping my voice steady. The neighbor's eyes softened. "Why, I used to see her outside with the little one," she added quietly. "Then one day, she was just gone. New people started coming in and out after that." I didn't ask more questions. Some answers arrive too early, and if you grab them too quickly, you miss what they're trying to show you. Instead, I walked toward the front of the mansion, not to knock, not to confront anyone, just close enough to see clearly. Through the wide windows, unfamiliar furniture sat where Nadine's soft, neutral pieces used to be. A woman's laugh echoed faintly from inside, sharp and comfortable, followed by a man's voice I recognized immediately. Damien. The sound confirmed what my eyes had already begun to accept. Strangers weren't visiting, they were living there. I felt to see if anger would come, but it didn't. Only a quiet stillness settled into my chest, with the kind that comes when confusion begins turning into understanding. The neighbor watched me carefully, as if waiting for a reaction that never arrived. "You okay?" she asked. "I will be," I replied simply. I folded the paper again, placed it gently into my purse, and turned back toward the car. The mansion stood behind me unchanged on the outside, yet no longer connected to the life I thought my daughter was living. As I slid into the driver's seat, I looked once more at the house. Not with disbelief, but with focus. Whatever had happened here was only the beginning. I started the engine, entered the apartment address into the navigation, and pulled away from the curb without looking back again. The GPS voice spoke calmly, guiding me through streets that felt unfamiliar despite the bright Florida sun. And for the first time since arriving, I felt certain of one thing. The real story wasn't waiting inside that mansion. It was waiting behind a door in a place my daughter was never meant to call home. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and something older. A quiet kind of wear that settled into buildings people pass through but never truly belong to. I checked the apartment number again before knocking, my knuckles tapping softly against a door that looked thinner than it should have been. For a moment, nothing moved on the other side. Then I heard small footsteps, a pause, the sound of a lock turning slowly. The door opened halfway and Nadine stood there holding her toddler on her hip. She froze when she saw me. Not joy, not surprise, just stillness, like she had forgotten how to breathe. "Mom?" she said, barely above a whisper. The word sounded unfamiliar coming from her mouth after months of silence. I didn't step forward immediately. I let my eyes take in the space behind her first. Narrow walls, a worn couch pushed too close to a small table, toys gathered in one corner as if they were trying to stay out of the way. Light from a single window fell across the room, thin and uneven. This was not the life I had built for her. The contrast hit quietly, not like a scream, but like a weight pressing down slowly. The daughter who once stood proudly at the gates of a $2 million mansion was now framed by a doorway that felt temporary, fragile. Nadine shifted her grip on the child, adjusting her posture like she was preparing for a conversation she didn't want to have. You didn't call," she said, her tone tightening just enough to sound distant. "I didn't know if you would answer," I replied gently. Her eyes flickered, then hardened slightly, a defense she had learned somewhere along the way. "You shouldn't have come like this. Damien said..." She stopped herself mid-sentence, pressing her lips together like she had said too much. There it was. Not anger, not independence. Guidance. Someone else's voice still sitting in her words. "I just wanted to see you," I said calmly, keeping my voice even, "and my grandbaby." The toddler leaned forward curiously, tiny fingers reaching toward my necklace like nothing in the world had changed. Nadine hesitated before stepping back to let me inside, her shoulders tense, movements careful, as if she was measuring every reaction. The apartment felt smaller once I crossed the threshold. Where a single-bedroom door half opened, revealing stacked boxes and a crib pressed close to the wall. No personal touches from the home she once decorated, no sign of the comfort she used to insist on creating wherever she lived. She closed the door behind me quickly, glancing toward the hallway like she expected someone to appear. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said, avoiding my eyes as she placed the toddler down gently. "I'm fine. Everything is fine." The words sounded rehearsed. I didn't challenge her. I simply looked around quietly, letting the silence speak where questions would have felt too sharp. Nadine crossed her arms, standing straighter now, her voice carrying a defensive edge. "People change, Mom. Life changes. You don't always understand everything from the outside." "I know," I said softly. That's why I came to see it for myself." For a second, the calm she was holding cracked, just a little. Her gaze dropped to the floor, then lifted again quickly, almost too quickly. That was when I noticed it. Not tears, not weakness, fear. It lived behind her calm expression, hidden carefully, like something she was trying to keep from being seen, even by me. And in that quiet moment, I realized my daughter wasn't just living differently. She was surviving something she didn't yet know how to name. Nadine didn't sit right away. She paced once across the small living room, then stopped near the window like she needed distance before speaking. The toddler played quietly on the floor, stacking small plastic blocks without understanding how heavy the silence had become. "You're wondering how I ended up here," she said finally, and her voice low but steady. "I'm listening," I replied. She nodded once, like she had rehearsed this conversation many times in her head, but never believed it would actually happen. "It started with paperwork," she said. "Damien said we needed to restructure things, make the house part of a bigger financial plan. He said it would protect us long term." Her hands tightened together as she spoke. "At first, I didn't want to sign anything, but he kept saying it was normal, that married couples combine things, that you would understand if I explained it the right way." She let out a quiet breath. "Then he introduced me to a lawyer." The way she said the word carried doubt. "What was his name?" I asked gently. "I don't even remember clearly," she admitted, shaking her head. "He wasn't from a big firm. He came to the house once. I sat at the dining table, talked fast, used a lot of words that sounded important but didn't really explain anything. Damien kept answering questions for me before I could finish asking them." She paused, swallowing. "I trusted him," she added softly, though it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself. "What did the papers say?" I asked. "That I was giving Damien temporary authority over the property. Just for refinancing," he said. "Just until some business situation settled." Her voice thinned. The lawyer kept nodding like it was routine. I didn't think I was giving anything away permanently. The room felt smaller as her words settled into place. "And after you signed?" I asked. Nadine looked toward the floor, her shoulders folding inward slightly. "At first, nothing changed. Or then Damien started spending more time at the house without me. He said it was easier for meetings, said I should stay here with a friend for a while until renovations finished." She gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "There were never any renovations." My silence gave her space to continue. "One day I went back to the mansion unannounced," she whispered. "Natasha opened the door." The name hung in the air. She looked comfortable, Nadine said, eyes unfocused as if replaying the moment. Like she had been living there longer than she should have been. Damien stood behind her like nothing was wrong. He said everything was temporary, that I was overreacting. She lifted her chin slightly, forcing strength into her posture. But they didn't leave. They just stayed. I felt something settle inside me then. Not shock, not anger. Clarity. So Damien and Natasha live there now, I said quietly. Nadine nodded once, the movement small but final. I didn't know what to do, she admitted. Every time I asked questions, Damien said the paperwork gave him authority, that it was legal, that fighting it would only make things worse. The toddler's laughter broke through the tension for a second, light and unaware, then faded again into the background. I watched my daughter carefully. The way she avoided certain words, the way her confidence hesitated at the edges. This wasn't a woman who willingly walked away from her life. This was someone who had been guided step by step into losing it. Bad luck didn't move this precisely. Confusion didn't write legal documents. As the pieces aligned quietly in my mind, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't an accident, and it was a plan. Nadine didn't look at me when she started talking again. She moved toward the kitchen counter, wiping a spot that was already clean, her hands busy the way people keep them when they are trying to hold themselves together. He said you didn't understand our marriage, she murmured. I stayed where I was, sitting quietly, giving her room to choose her words without feeling cornered. At first it sounded small, she continued, just little things. He would say you were too involved, that you still saw me as a child, that if I wanted him to feel respected, I needed to create boundaries. Her voice didn't carry anger, only a tired honesty. I listened. That's why I stopped answering your calls right away, she admitted. He said it was healthy. Said married people shouldn't run back to their parents every time something felt hard. She let out a slow breath. And when you asked questions, he'd tell me you were trying to control my decisions. The toddler crawled closer to her leg, holding onto her jeans. Nadine picked the child up automatically, pressing a soft kiss to the small forehead before continuing. It didn't happen all at once, she said. It was gradual. He'd suggest things like, maybe I shouldn't tell you everything anymore. Maybe we needed privacy. Then he started saying you didn't trust him, that your kindness came with expectations. Her eyes finally lifted to meet mine, searching for anger that never came. I thought I was protecting my marriage, she whispered. And I didn't realize I was giving him space to change my life without you seeing it. I felt the ache of her confession, but I didn't interrupt. There are moments when love listens instead of correcting. He even helped me draft the message telling you not to call, she added quietly. I thought it sounded mature. Independent. I didn't know it sounded like goodbye. The room fell into a stillness that felt heavier than before. I folded my hands together, keeping my voice calm. You did what you believed was right at the time, I said. That doesn't make you wrong. It just means you trusted someone who didn't deserve it. Her shoulders softened slightly, relief passing across her face like she had been bracing for disappointment instead of understanding. I kept telling myself you'd be proud of me for standing on my own, she admitted. But every time something felt off, he'd remind me that going back to you would make me look convinced he couldn't lead. Isolation dressed as independence. I didn't need to say the words aloud. They were already sitting between us. Nadine's voice dropped lower. When I started questioning the papers, that's when he became colder. He said I was letting you influence me even though we hadn't spoken, like your presence alone was a threat to him. I nodded slowly, not in agreement with Damien, but in recognition of the pattern forming. Silence had not been an accident. It had been taught, carefully, step by step. I stood gently, smoothing my dress, my movements unhurried. Nadine watched me closely, waiting for a reaction that never arrived. No raised voice, no lecture, no visible anger. I'm going to step outside for a moment, I said softly. She hesitated. Are you upset with me? I shook my head. No, Nadine, I'm paying attention. Her eyes followed me as I walked toward the door, the weight of everything unsaid filling the room behind me. The hallway felt cooler when I stepped out. I closed the door quietly, reached into my purse, and pulled out my phone. My fingers didn't tremble as I searched for a number I hadn't needed in years. When the call connected, I didn't waste words. I need you to start gathering information, I said calmly into the receiver. Everything tied to a property transfer in Florida, and I want you to look closely at the lawyer involved. There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, professional response. Understood. As I ended the call, with the certainty that had woken me that morning settled fully into place, this wasn't just about a house, and for the first time since arriving, I allowed myself to admit what I had already begun to suspect. Someone had built this silence on purpose, and I was about to take it apart piece by piece. The hallway outside Nadine's apartment was quiet enough that my footsteps sounded louder than usual. I didn't go far, just enough distance to think clearly. The lawyer answered on the second ring. Rosalind, he said, his tone calm, familiar. We had worked together years ago when I first arranged the property transfer for Nadine's wedding gift. A man who spoke less and listened more, which is why I trusted him now. I need you to look at something, I said. A house in Florida. Documents my daughter signed under pressure. I believe authority was transferred without full understanding. There was a brief pause. Not hesitation, just calculation. Do you have copies of anything? He asked. Not yet, I replied, but I will. He didn't rush into promises. That was the first reason I knew I had called the right person. Start with the basics, he said. Ownership records, power of attorney filings, lien activity, any refinancing attempts. If the structure changed, it left a trail. I leaned lightly against the wall, watching the sunlight creep across the floor. Something about this doesn't feel clean, I added quietly. An unfamiliar lawyer, fast explanations, pressure to sign. He exhaled slowly. That combination alone raises concerns, he said, especially if she wasn't advised independently. The word independently settled heavily in my chest. And I'll begin pulling public records immediately, he continued. But I need one thing from you, patience. If this was done improperly, we move carefully. No direct confrontation yet. I understand, I said. After the call ended, I stayed still for a moment, letting the calm settle around me again. Anger would have been easy. Loud reactions would have been expected, but clarity required quiet. When I stepped back inside the apartment, Nadine looked up from the couch, searching my face. Everything okay? She asked. Yes, I said gently. I just needed to make a call. She nodded, though uncertainty lingered behind her eyes. Hours passed softly. The toddler napped. Nadine moved around the apartment in slow, restless motions, as if she wanted to ask more but didn't know how. I didn't press her. And sometimes people need time to watch you remain steady before they believe they are safe. My phone vibrated just after midday. I stepped toward the window before answering. I've started reviewing the property records, the lawyer said. And Rosalind, there are irregularities. I didn't interrupt. The authority Damien holds appears broader than what's typical for temporary financial arrangements, he continued. There are filings suggesting Nadine's control was reduced significantly after the documents were signed. That's not something that happens accidentally. The room felt smaller, though my breathing stayed even. What kind of irregularities? I asked. Timing, he replied. The filings were submitted unusually fast, and the lawyer involved, he doesn't have a strong professional footprint. Very few verified cases. That alone isn't proof of wrongdoing, but it's concerning. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of the words. Could she have been misled? I asked quietly. Another pause. Longer, this time. I won't say anything definitively yet, he answered. But if she signed without full understanding, and if someone applied pressure or limited her access to independent advice, we may be looking at coercion. The word hung between us. And possibly fraud, he added carefully. I thanked him and ended the call, keeping my expression neutral as I turned back toward Nadine. She was watching me again, waiting for a reaction I refused to give too soon. Because in that moment, I understood something clearly. This wasn't just a family conflict. It was a structure someone built deliberately. And the first cracks had finally begun to show. I didn't tell Nadine where I was going. She was resting when I left the apartment. The toddler curled beside her, small hands wrapped around the edge of her shirt like a quiet anchor. I moved carefully, closing the door without sound because some steps are easier to take alone. The drive back to the mansion felt shorter this time. Not because the distance changed, but because uncertainty had turned into focus. I parked 2 houses down, far enough not to draw attention, and stepped out slowly. The neighborhood still looked perfect on the surface. Trimmed hedges, silent gates, sunlight reflecting off polished windows. Nothing about it suggested betrayal lived behind one of those doors. I walked along the sidewalk like a stranger passing through, stopping briefly near the edge of the driveway. The front gate stood slightly open, just enough to see into the garden I once helped Nadine design. Roses she chose herself, now rearranged into a pattern I didn't recognize. Then the front door opened. Natasha stepped outside first. She carried herself with an ease that didn't belong to a guest. Her movements were slow, unhurried, like someone who had grown comfortable inside a space that was never meant to be hers. A moment later, Damien followed behind her, speaking quietly, his tone softer than I had ever heard when he spoke to Nadine. They didn't see me. Natasha reached back toward him, her hand brushing his arm briefly, a gesture too familiar to be accidental. He leaned closer to say something I couldn't hear, and she laughed. Not loudly, just enough to fill the air between them. I stood still, letting the scene settle without reacting. There was no argument. No confrontation. Only observation. Damien walked past her to adjust something near the car parked in the driveway, and Natasha followed without hesitation, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The distance between them held a quiet intimacy, not open, not obvious, but present enough to change the shape of everything Nadine had told me. I didn't need explanations. Body language speaks louder than rehearsed words. After a few minutes, they disappeared back inside the mansion, the door closing gently behind them. I exhaled slowly, allowing the weight of what I had seen to settle. The house looked the same from the outside, but its energy felt different, colder, reorganized, as if every decision made there now belonged to someone else's agenda. My phone vibrated in my purse. I stepped away from the gate before answering. "I've been reviewing additional records," the lawyer said without greeting. His voice carried a seriousness that tightened the air around me. "There's more activity tied to the property than we first realized." I listened carefully. Funds were moved through accounts connected to Damien shortly after the authority transfer, he continued, and some payments appear linked to individuals not previously disclosed, including the lawyer who handled the documents. "Is it illegal?" I asked quietly. "I can't conclude that yet," he replied, "but the pattern is unusual. Financial decisions were made very quickly after Nadine signed, faster than most legitimate restructures would allow." I watched the mansion door as he spoke, remembering Natasha's hand brushing Damien's arm, and the way they moved together without hesitation. "This is starting to look less like poor judgment," he added carefully, and more like coordinated planning. The words settled into place with the images I had just witnessed. Not coincidence, not misunderstanding. Structure. "I'll keep digging," he said. "But Rosalind, prepare yourself. The deeper we look, the more complicated this may become." I ended the call slowly, slipping the phone back into my purse as I turned away from the house that used to belong to my daughter. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Because sometimes the strongest move is to let people believe they are unseen, right until the truth arrives at their door. The apartment felt quieter that evening. Nadine sat across from me at the small dining table, the toddler asleep in the next room, and the faint hum of traffic outside filling the spaces between our words. She watched me carefully as I placed a thin folder on the table. Nothing dramatic, just a few printed documents the lawyer had already begun sending through. "I'm not here to overwhelm you," I said gently, "but there are things you deserve to understand clearly." Her fingers hovered over the papers before touching them, like she was unsure whether seeing the truth would make things better or worse. "What is all this?" she asked. "Public records," I replied. "Filings tied to the house, dates, authorizations." She skimmed the first page, her brow tightening. "I don't remember agreeing to this level of control," she murmured. "That's because you didn't," I said softly. Said not fully. The lawyer had explained it earlier that day, how the unprofessional attorney Damien introduced had guided Nadine through the signing process in a way that blurred clarity. Key explanations were rushed. Independent advice was never offered. The documents themselves were written in language that expanded Damien's authority far beyond what Nadine believed she was granting. "It looks bigger than what he told me," she admitted, flipping to another page. "That's part of the problem," I said. "Legal guidance should protect you, not confuse you." Her shoulders sank slightly, and for the first time since I arrived, she didn't try to defend Damien's choices. Instead, she read quietly, her lips moving as if she was rehearing conversations from months ago. "He kept answering questions for me," she whispered after a moment. "Oh, the lawyer barely looked at me. I thought that meant he trusted Damien to explain things clearly." I didn't rush to respond. Realization has its own pace. Another document slid forward, showing how the filings had been processed almost immediately after she signed, faster than most routine transactions. "They moved quickly," I said, "almost like they were waiting for your signature." Nadine's eyes lifted slowly. "So, you think this was planned from the start?" "I think you were influenced in ways that weren't fair to you," I answered carefully. She leaned back in her chair, pressing her hands against her temples. "I kept telling myself I was being dramatic when things started feeling off," she admitted. "Every time I asked Damien for clarity, he'd say I was letting fear control me." Silence settled again, heavy but honest, and her gaze drifted toward the bedroom where her child slept, then back to the papers on the table. "I thought I was building a future," she said quietly. "I didn't realize I was signing pieces of it away." My phone buzzed against the table. I answered, stepping slightly aside to give her space, while still keeping my voice low. "I've reviewed more of the lawyer's history," the attorney on the other end said. "He has prior complaints, not criminal, but enough to raise concerns about misleading clients." That didn't surprise me. "There's another development," he continued. "While digging through financial timelines tied to Damien's accounts, something unrelated surfaced. A past death in his family, officially ruled an accident years ago." My attention sharpened. "What kind of accident?" I asked quietly. "A fall," he said. "His father. And the circumstances were never challenged publicly, but the financial movements around that time mirror what we're seeing now. Sudden control shifts, rapid decisions." The air in the room changed. I glanced back at Nadine, who was watching me now, sensing the shift without hearing the words. "We don't have proof of wrongdoing," the lawyer added quickly, "but the pattern is worth noting." I ended the call slowly, my mind connecting pieces that had once felt separate. When I returned to the table, Nadine searched my face for answers. "What is it?" she asked. I didn't give her everything at once. But as I sat back down and looked at the documents spread before us, one thought settled heavily into place. This situation reached further back than either of us had imagined, and somewhere in Damien's past, a story everyone believed was finished had just begun to resurface. The story about Damien's father had never come up in detail before. Nadine only mentioned him once when she first got married, a quiet sentence about a tragic accident years earlier, something that happened long before she entered the picture. At the time, I accepted it the way people accept old family grief, respectfully, without asking too many questions. But that evening, the lawyer's voice carried a different weight. "I've spoken with a private investigator I trust," he told me over the phone. He reviewed archived reports tied to the incident. There are details that don't align as cleanly as they should. I stood near the apartment window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. "What kind of details?" I asked. "The official record says Damien's father fell at home," he explained. "Ruled an accident, no prolonged investigation. But the timeline around property changes after the death looks strategic. Control shifted quickly. Decisions were made almost immediately." The word control stayed with me long after the call ended. Inside the apartment, Nadine sat quietly on the couch, scrolling through old photos on her phone, pictures from a time when she believed she was stepping into stability. I didn't interrupt her yet. Some truths need preparation before they land. The next morning, and I drove back toward the mansion again, not to confront anyone, only to observe. Natasha stepped outside just as I passed along the sidewalk. She didn't see me at first. Her phone was pressed tightly to her ear, her voice low but tense. She paced near the gate, glancing over her shoulder more than once like someone waiting for reassurance that never came. "They're asking questions again," I heard her say before her voice dropped too low to follow. Her posture had changed since the last time I saw her. The ease she once carried had been replaced with something tighter, a nervous energy that clung to her movements. She ended the call quickly and stood still for a moment, staring toward the street like she felt watched. I continued walking past without slowing. Sometimes tension speaks louder than confession. Later that afternoon, the lawyer called again. The investigator pulled witness statements from the original accident, he said. Nothing conclusive, but enough inconsistencies to raise concerns. Certain details were never fully clarified. Who was present, who called for help, how quickly events unfolded. I listened carefully. "And Natasha?" I asked. "She was connected to the household even then," he replied. "Not publicly central, but present enough that her name appears more than once in secondary notes." That piece settled heavily into place. "What happens next?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "We don't make accusations. We let the information speak for itself. I forwarded the irregularities to the proper authorities for review, quietly. If they find enough reason, they'll decide whether to reopen the case." I ended the call and sat still for a long moment. Back at the apartment, Nadine sensed the shift immediately when I walked in. "What's going on?" she asked softly. I chose my words carefully. "The past doesn't stay buried forever," I said, "especially when patterns begin repeating." She didn't press further, but I saw the unease settle behind her eyes. That evening, as the sky darkened outside the window, my phone lit up again with a short message from the lawyer. They're reviewing the file formally. I read the words twice before locking the screen, because for the first time since arriving in Florida, it felt like the truth wasn't just being uncovered by us anymore. Someone official had started asking questions. And once authorities begin looking back at a story everyone believed was finished, it rarely stays an accident for long. The first official document arrived quietly. No dramatic knock, no raised voices, just an email forwarded from the lawyer early that morning. A formal notice challenging the authority Damien held over the mansion. I read it slowly, twice, letting every word settle before showing Nadine. "This doesn't mean everything changes overnight," I told her gently as she sat across from me. "It just means the process has begun." Her eyes moved across the screen, uncertainty mixing with relief. "So, he can't just keep pretending the house belongs to him?" "Not without answering questions," I said. The toddler's laughter filled the background for a moment, light and unaware, and breaking the tension just enough for Nadine's shoulders to relax. She looked different now, still tired, but steadier, less defensive, like she was beginning to see the structure that had held her in place slowly losing its grip. That afternoon, Damien called. His name lit up on her phone and she hesitated before answering. I didn't move closer. I simply stayed where I was, letting her choose how to handle it. "Why is your mother involved in legal things?" His voice came through sharply, even from a distance. "You're letting her turn this into a fight we don't need." Nadine's posture stiffened. "She's not turning anything into a fight," she said carefully. "She's just helping me understand what I signed." A pause followed, heavy, calculated. "You're overthinking this," Damien replied, his tone softening into something almost persuasive. "Oh, you know I did everything for us. For stability. Don't let outside voices make you doubt your own husband." I watched Nadine's face closely. Months ago, those words might have pulled her back into silence. Now, she didn't answer right away. She looked at me briefly, not for permission, but for grounding. And I gave her nothing but calm stillness in return. "I'm not doubting you," she said slowly. "I'm just asking questions now." The shift was small, but it mattered. His voice tightened. "Questions lead to problems, Nadine. You know how complicated things get when lawyers start interfering." "I didn't understand the papers before," she replied, her voice quieter but firmer. "I want to understand them now." The call ended shortly after, Damien's frustration lingering in the silence he left behind. Nadine set the phone down carefully, and exhaling like she had just stepped out of a room that used to control her breathing. "He always made it sound like independence meant pushing you away," she admitted softly. "But now, it feels like clarity means standing closer to you." I didn't respond with emotion, only a small nod. Because trust doesn't rebuild through speeches. It rebuilds through moments like this. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again. "This is moving faster than expected," the lawyer said. "We've filed preliminary challenges to the authority transfer, and Rosalind, Damien has been formally notified." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means he'll have to respond," he said. "And based on the additional financial concerns we uncovered, the court wants clarity sooner rather than later." A brief silence followed. "There's something else," he added. "The summons has been issued. Both sides will need to appear." The word hung in the air, heavier than any argument. Court. I thanked him and ended the call, turning back toward Nadine as she watched me carefully. "What happened?" she asked. I placed the phone down gently on the table, my voice steady. "The truth has started moving," I said. "And now, it's heading into a courtroom." The courtroom felt smaller than people imagine. No shouting, no dramatic entrances, just quiet movement. Papers sliding across desks, low conversations between attorneys, the steady rhythm of a process that cared more about facts than emotions. Nadine sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a simple dress, nothing loud, nothing defensive. For the first time since I arrived in Florida, she looked grounded. Not because the situation had become easier, but because she was no longer facing it alone. Across the room, Damien sat with his lawyer, his posture composed but stiff. Natasha sat a few seats behind him, her expression calm at first glance, though her fingers tapped lightly against her knee. A small detail most people wouldn't notice. The judge entered without ceremony and the proceedings began. Our lawyer didn't rush. He spoke in a measured tone, walking through timelines instead of accusations. How Nadine had signed documents without independent legal guidance, how authority had shifted unusually fast afterward, how financial movements aligned too closely with the transfer of control. No one raised their voice. The evidence spoke quietly, line by line. Documents appeared on screens, signatures, dates, or authorization language that extended further than Nadine had been told. The court reviewed recordings from consultations, where the unprofessional lawyer answered questions before Nadine could finish asking them, guiding her toward decisions she didn't fully understand. "This is not about punishing a spouse for business decisions," our lawyer said calmly. "It is about whether consent was informed and whether influence crossed into coercion." The room remained still. Damien's lawyer argued that everything had been voluntary, that Nadine trusted her husband and chose to follow his lead. But even he avoided strong statements, careful not to promise more than the documents could support. When Natasha was called to speak briefly about the living arrangements at the mansion, her composure wavered for the first time, since she answered simply at first, saying she was staying there temporarily, that she had no involvement in legal decisions. But when questions shifted toward financial timelines and her proximity to Damien during key events, her voice tightened. She glanced toward him once quickly, like she was searching for direction. It was subtle, yet the room felt the shift. Nadine didn't look at them. She watched the documents instead, absorbing each detail as if seeing her own past from a distance. The judge listened quietly, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Not dramatic, just precise. After several hours, he leaned back slightly, reviewing notes. "This court recognizes sufficient concern regarding the circumstances under which authority over the property was transferred," he said evenly. "Further review is warranted." No applause. A no visible victory, just progress. As people began gathering their belongings, our lawyer stepped aside to answer a call. His expression changed slightly, not alarmed, but serious enough to catch my attention. When he returned, his voice stayed low. "The property issue isn't the only thing drawing attention anymore," he said to me quietly. "The financial irregularities and new information about Damien's family history. Authorities are expanding their scope." Nadine's eyes lifted slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means this may no longer be just a civil matter," he replied. "They're beginning to look at whether criminal elements exist beyond the property dispute." The words settled heavily between us. As we walked out of the courtroom, Natasha's calm finally cracked completely. She spoke sharply to Damien in hushed tones, and her movements tense, her eyes scanning the room as if she expected something to change at any moment. I didn't confront them. I simply watched, because the quietest moments often signal the loudest consequences. And as the courthouse doors closed behind us, one truth became impossible to ignore. What began as a fight over a house was turning into something much bigger than any of us had imagined. The second hearing felt heavier even before it began, not louder, just tighter, like the air itself knew something had shifted since the last time we sat in that courtroom. Nadine walked beside me with steadier steps now, her posture straighter, her silence no longer defensive, but observant. Our lawyer met us quietly near the entrance. "There are developments," he said, keeping his voice low. Additional information came forward during the expanded investigation. Some of it may be uncomfortable to hear, but it clarifies more than it confuses." Nadine nodded slowly. "I'd rather know the truth." Inside the courtroom, the tone remained professional. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Documents moved from one desk to another, while officials reviewed timelines that stretched far beyond the property dispute. It started with small inconsistencies. Phone records showing Damien and Natasha communicating frequently long before Nadine ever questioned the house paperwork. Financial transfers that overlapped with their private meetings. Witness statements describing how often Natasha appeared at the mansion, even when Nadine wasn't present. No one used the word affair immediately, but the pattern built itself quietly, piece by piece. When Damien's attorney attempted to downplay the connection as family support, the opposing counsel introduced a sequence of messages that shifted the atmosphere in the room. Nothing explicit. Just language too personal, too familiar to belong to a casual relationship. Natasha's composure faltered first. She adjusted her seat repeatedly, her eyes moving toward Damien and away again, like she was measuring every reaction he gave. When questioned briefly about her role in the household during the months leading up to the property transfer, her answers came slower than before. "I was helping," she said. "That's all." But the timeline said more than her words. The judge allowed the discussion to remain focused, reminding both sides that emotional speculation was not evidence. Still, the truth lingered in the way Damien avoided looking directly at Nadine, in the way Natasha's voice tightened when dates aligned too closely with private meetings. Then came the deeper revelation. Our lawyer presented findings from the investigator regarding Damien's father's death. Not accusations, just newly surfaced inconsistencies. Financial decisions made immediately afterward. Authority changes that mirrored the pattern seen in Nadine's case. The courtroom remained silent as the information was entered into record. "This is not a criminal trial at this stage," the judge clarified evenly, but the court acknowledges that the emerging pattern warrants further review by appropriate authorities. Nadine didn't cry. She didn't confront Damien or Natasha. She simply sat still, absorbing the weight of a truth she could no longer deny, that the distance between her and her husband had not been an accident, and that the woman now living in her house had never been just a relative offering support. Her hand moved slowly across the table until it rested near mine, not gripping, not seeking protection, just grounding herself in something real. "I see it now," she whispered under her breath, barely audible. "All of it." I didn't answer. Some realizations belong to the person who finally reaches them. As proceedings wrapped for the day, our lawyer stepped closer again, his voice steady but firm. "The authorities reviewing the expanded evidence have decided to move forward," he said quietly. "What started as a civil matter is now opening the door to formal criminal charges." Nadine's eyes lifted slowly. What kind of charges?" she asked. He paused, careful, precise. "Fraud-related allegations connected to the property," he replied, "and to potential inquiries tied to the older case involving Damien's father." Across the room, Damien's confidence looked thinner than before. Natasha stood beside him, her calm expression cracking at the edges as officials spoke quietly with their legal team. No shouting, no chaos, just consequences moving forward, step by step. And as we walked out of the courthouse again, one truth followed us into the sunlight. The secrets they believed were buried had finally reached the surface. And this time, they weren't sinking back down. The final hearing didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure moving carefully into place. The courtroom remained calm, like the same quiet rhythm guiding every moment. Papers reviewed, statements confirmed, decisions delivered without drama. Damien stood beside his attorney, his posture stiff, the confidence he once carried replaced with something heavier. Natasha sat a few seats away, her composure thinner than before, her gaze rarely lifting from the floor. When the judge spoke, his voice carried no emotion, only clarity. "The court finds sufficient evidence of fraudulent influence and improper control over the property in question," he said steadily. "Authority over the mansion is hereby restored to Nadine, effective immediately." Nadine inhaled slowly beside me, her shoulders lifting and falling like she was releasing a weight she had carried for months. There was no applause, no visible reaction from me, only stillness. And the proceedings continued quietly as sentencing for the related financial offenses moved forward. Damien listened without interruption, his expression fixed, while Natasha's hands tightened together, the last of her calm slipping away in small, almost invisible movements. Consequences arrived the way they often do in real life, without spectacle. Not loud revenge, not humiliation, just accountability. As the judge finished outlining the penalties, the room remained silent, absorbing the finality of decisions that had taken months to unfold. Officials spoke softly with Damien's legal team, while Natasha stared ahead like she was trying to understand how quickly certainty can disappear. Nadine didn't look at them. Then she watched the documents being signed, the same kind of paperwork that once took control away from her, now returning it quietly, legally, without chaos. Our lawyer leaned closer to us after the ruling. "It's done," he said simply. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt warmer than usual. People moved around us without recognizing the significance of what had just happened, and I preferred it that way. Victory didn't need witnesses. Nadine stood beside me, holding the restored property documents carefully, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "You knew this would come together," she said softly. "I knew truth moves slowly," I replied. "But it moves." We drove back in silence, the mansion appearing at the end of the street like a memory waiting to become real again. Nadine stepped out of the car first, her gaze lingering on the front gate, not with excitement, but with understanding. She walked inside slowly, taking in the space she had once been pushed out of. The rooms felt familiar yet different, like a life paused and then returned. I remained near the doorway, watching her reclaim the space without interruption. No celebration, no speeches, just quiet dignity. As the afternoon light settled across the living room, Nadine turned toward me, her eyes softer than they had been since I arrived in Florida. "Mom," she began, her voice breaking slightly before she finished the sentence. She hesitated, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she finally did. "I need to ask you something," she said quietly. I waited. Her gaze dropped for a moment before lifting again, steady and vulnerable all at once. Can you forgive me for pushing you away when you were the only person trying to protect me?" The house felt quieter than I remembered. Not empty, just still, like it had been waiting for the right footsteps to return before breathing again. Nadine walked through the front door slowly, the toddler balanced on her hip, small fingers clutching the collar of her dress. She paused just inside the entrance, her eyes moving across the familiar walls with a kind of careful recognition. "This place feels different," she said softly. "It's the same house," I replied. "You're just seeing it with clearer eyes." She nodded, not arguing. The toddler slipped down from her arms and wandered toward the living room, laughter echoing lightly against the high ceilings. That sound changed everything. Where tension once lived, warmth began to return, not loud, not forced, just present in the small moments. Nadine walked through each room without rushing. She didn't touch the furniture immediately. Instead, she stood near the window where she used to drink coffee in the mornings, letting the sunlight rest on her face like she was reacquainting herself with a version of life she thought she had lost. I stayed behind her, quiet. Rebuilding doesn't begin with speeches. It begins with shared silence that feels safe again. The toddler found a toy left behind from months ago, a small wooden car tucked beneath a chair, and ran toward Nadine with excitement. She knelt down instinctively, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since arriving in Florida. "That's yours," she whispered to the child. "We're home." The word didn't sound triumphant. It sounded relieved. Over the next few days, we moved carefully through the house together, unpacking small boxes, adjusting curtains, clearing out reminders of people who no longer belonged there. Nadine didn't ask me to lead. She made decisions herself now, occasionally glancing at me for reassurance, but never for permission. Trust was rebuilding quietly. One afternoon, she stood beside me in the kitchen while we prepared a simple meal, the toddler drawing on a sheet of paper nearby. "I thought independence meant not needing you," she said suddenly, her voice thoughtful. "Now I realize it means choosing the right people to stand with." I didn't respond with advice. I simply handed her another plate to dry, letting the rhythm of ordinary life carry the conversation forward. Later that week, Nadine invited a few close friends and neighbors to the house, not for a celebration, just for a quiet gathering to mark a new beginning. People moved through the space gently, offering hugs, soft laughter, and the kind of support that didn't ask for details. I stayed near the back of the room, content to watch rather than lead. The toddler ran through the living room chasing bubbles someone had brought, filling the air with lightness that felt earned rather than staged. Nadine stood near the center of the room, her posture calm, her voice steady when she began to speak. "I don't want to make this a big moment," she said, glancing briefly toward me before addressing the small crowd. "But I do want to acknowledge something important." My attention lifted. She took a slow breath, her eyes finding mine with quiet certainty. "There's someone here who never stopped believing in me, even when I stopped believing in myself," she continued, "and I wouldn't be standing in this house today without her." The room grew still. Nadine turned fully toward me then, her expression open, sincere. And for the first time since everything began, she chose to say it where everyone could hear. "Thank you, Mom." The house settled into a new rhythm slowly, not the same rhythm it once had, softer, quieter, shaped by everything we had walked through together. Morning light returned to the kitchen windows. The toddler's laughter filled the hallways again, and Nadine moved through the rooms with a steadiness that felt earned rather than given. I watched her one afternoon as she stood near the dining table, reviewing documents with a calm focus I hadn't seen before. So not papers filled with pressure or confusion, just simple plans for the future. She asked questions without hesitation now. She read every line carefully. She didn't rush decisions to please anyone. Independence had returned to her, but it looked different this time. It wasn't distance. It was clarity. She noticed me watching and smiled gently. "I'm not afraid to make choices anymore," she said. "Not because I know everything, but because I know I can trust myself again." I nodded quietly. That was all I needed to hear. The legal battles had ended weeks earlier. Damien and Natasha were no longer part of the life unfolding inside these walls, and the mansion itself felt less like a symbol of loss and more like a space rebuilt with intention. There had been no celebrations, no public declarations of victory, just peace. The kind that arrives after truth has done its work. One evening, after the toddler had fallen asleep, Nadine joined me on the patio. The sky was clear, the air warm, the kind of night that invites reflection without forcing it. "You never fought them loudly," she said after a long silence. "You just moved quietly until everything changed." "Loud battles aren't always strong ones," I replied gently. "Sometimes strength looks like patience." She leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "I used to think you were trying to control my life," she admitted. "Now I understand you were protecting it in ways I couldn't see yet." I didn't answer right away. Some truths don't need explanation. They need time. Later that night, my phone rested beside me on the kitchen counter. It was silent now after weeks of constant updates from lawyers and investigators. I picked it up and held it for a moment, remembering the call I made outside that small apartment hallway, the one that began unraveling everything built on deception. That single moment had changed the direction of our lives, not because it was loud, but because it was certain. Nadine stepped into the room then, her expression calm, her shoulders lighter than they had been since the day I arrived in Florida unannounced. "I'm grateful you listened to that feeling," she said softly. "So am I," I replied. The house felt full again, not just with furniture or security, but with understanding. Nadine moved forward with a clearer sense of herself, and I stepped back without fear, knowing our bond no longer depended on control or distance. Peace had replaced tension. Not revenge, just peace. As the night settled around us, I realized something quietly powerful. The instinct that woke me that morning had never been about saving a house. It was about saving my child. And as I turned off the kitchen lights and followed Nadine toward the hallway, one final truth settled gently into place. They thought taking her house would break her future. They never imagined it would bring her back home.